This is our very last session, and I find this very distressing because I haven't covered all the material I wanted to cover, but still, we got off, as they say, to a good start. I can't resist telling you a little bit about the history of course evaluations. These were invented in the years after the Second World War, and I sat on the student committee at the University of Wisconsin that designed the very first course evaluation for the University of Wisconsin. And there were several things that were absolutely axiomatic. One is, no one must ever see the course evaluations except the professor himself or herself. No administrator was ever supposed to see any of these. They were strictly designed to help the professor improve the teaching in the course. Well, that can't survive. The administrators are desperate to get their hands on these things so they can see who's succeeding and who's not. Furthermore, in those days, we had no numerical scores. Now you've got to have a numerical score. And routinely, on letters of recommendation, you say, he scored a total of 6.7 out of a possible 7, or something like that. I mean, you've got to have a high score. Furthermore, it's quite scandalous in universities that are, as they say, tuition-driven, meaning you better be popular with the students or the damn university will go broke. We're going broke regardless, so it doesn't seem to matter. But in those cases, then, it's very important for the professor's promotion to get high enrollments, and that means, for example, it's hard to give bad grades. I'm told at Stanford, as a matter of policy, they no longer give Fs. This is an anecdote, so it's not a scientific result. And I guess the reason is nobody's going to pay $40,000 a year for their children to get an F in a course. So anyway, there are sorts of structural corruptions that come in. Now, in the early days, well, not all that early. I was already a professor in Berkeley when I was chairman of the Berkeley Philosophy Department, and we had to put people up for promotion. The rules then insisted that you had to have some evidence of teaching. Many professors simply refused to have these course evaluations. So I had to write letters to individual undergraduates and ask them for their opinions about Professor Jones or Professor Smith. They were always delighted to provide these letters, and I was astounded by the sophistication of the letters. You know, you think this is an undergraduate kid. What does he or she know about the difficulties of teaching the course? They were extremely perceptive. Their antennae for spotting phoniness took my breath away with its sensitivity. Anyway, I was quite impressed by that, and what it suggests to me is they somehow learned the background. They may not have learned the details of epistemology, but they certainly understood the dynamics of the classroom situation. Okay, that's all by way of footnote about the particular exercise that you're going through now. It's now part of the great computerized record of your teaching. Is what numerical scores you got on these evaluation sheets. All right, now this is our last time, and I'm not lecturing on new material, but there were some things that came up last time that I want to go over in more detail. So there are 3 topics that I'm going to talk about at varying lengths, and then I'll really open it up to anything that anybody else wants to talk about. And you remember, you have a sample exam question sheet, and you can ask about anything that's on that sheet, or for that matter, anything else. I don't say that these questions will be on the exam, but you remember I did say that if you can answer all of the questions on the sample sheet, then I would think you probably wouldn't have too much trouble with the exam. Now, there's some things that are not on that sheet that ought to be on it. For example, there's no reference to Fodor's approach to explanation in the social sciences. I'm not promising you or threatening you that there will be a question about Fodor, but at least you ought to be ready for that, and various other things that, out of laziness, forgetfulness, stupidity, or whatever else, I just didn't list on I didn't put on the sample sheet that you had. So don't suppose that covers all possible questions. Now, how is the exam to be organized? Well, I was looking at last year's. It's a pretty good exam, actually, and it was organized into 3 parts. Answered 2 questions of each part, and each part had about 4 questions in it. One was social ontology. There has to be a section on that. A second was on rationality, and a third was the philosophy of social sciences and the application of the theories. Now, you could do it in 4 parts, 1 on social ontology, 1 on rationality, 1 on general problems of social explanation, and one on applications of my theory to things like human rights and political power and all of those other issues that we talked about. So you will have a choice, and there will be a division. And again, don't take the divisions too seriously, because of course that naturally there'll be some overlap. Okay, so all of that is by way of reminding you, and you know when and where the exam is. It's in this room. Now, while you're giving this exam, give or take jet lag, I will be giving a lecture in Exeter University in England, but I'll be back at the end of next week. I go on Monday. I guess I won't be lecturing on. I don't lecture till Wednesday. Thank God for that. Okay, so and then I'll lecture Wednesday and Thursday and come back on Friday. So I'll be back at the end of next week, and then the following week, by which time I guess you will all have dispersed. I will be around, and I'll be on the campus insofar as the campus is open. All right. Now, as I said, I'm going to talk about three things. One is I spoke with some unclarity about the notion of agentive functions. So let me make that perfectly clear. If you look on page 121 of the Construction of Social Reality, I only have the English edition here, but they save money by using the same print plates for both. You'll see there's a chart, a taxonomy of the different ways, of the different kinds of facts. And I maintain that all assignments of function are observer relative. And then under assignment of function, I cite two types of assignment of functions. Non-agentive functions, such as, for example, the function of the heart is to pump blood, where nobody actually has to do anything. The damn heart just does it on its own. And then I cite, in addition to that, agentive functions, such as this is a screwdriver. And then under agentive functions, I cite two kinds, and those are status functions, which is the main topic of the theory. That is, those functions which can only be performed in virtue of the collective assignment, acceptance, or recognition of a certain status which the person or object has, and in virtue of that collective recognition of a status, the object can perform a function that it could not perform otherwise. And then, in addition to status functions, there are the other agentive functions, which are causal agentive functions, such as this is a screwdriver, or this is a car, or this is a cell phone. And the idea there, the basic intuitive idea, is that both institutional facts, which are status functions, and causal agentive functions are observer relative. That is, the function only exists relative to some human or animal intentionality. But, and this is the key point, in the case of causal agentive functions, the entity can perform its function solely in virtue of its causal structure. This damn thing works. Well, I guess I've never figured out how it works, but I'm told that it works if you push the right buttons, and the various things happen at the other end. But in the case of money or governments or private property, it's not in virtue of the causal structure, but in virtue of the attitudes that we take. So that's the basic idea. Under agentive functions, you have two categories: causal agentive functions, and those are things like screwdrivers, bathtubs, cars, and fountain pens, where it's the causal mechanism that enables it to function. And then there are status functions, where the recognition of the status enables it to function. Now, by this time, you know perfectly well that there are lots of cases where the causal agentive function acquires a status. So, for example, I am physically able to drive a car no matter what anybody says, but they won't, and watch this deontic vocabulary, I will not be allowed or permitted or authorized to drive a car without a California driver's permit, without a driver's license, as it's called. And I forget what it says on the damn thing. You can't even buy a beer nowadays without waiving, well, I can't, but you probably can't, without waiving these. What? Everybody, nobody, don't let anybody leave the room. I can't find my driver's license. All right, it must be here somewhere. Ah, found it. Okay. It says, well, how unimaginatively, it says driver license. They don't even have the genitive. No, they don't. Just says driver license. Anyway, that's what it is. It is a status function indicator, and you know what that is. Okay, so you do get this overlap where causal agentive functions typically have to be authorized. Why? Well, a lot depends on it. Yeah, you want to make sure that the guy's able to drive before you let him on the road. And similarly with being a licensed brain surgeon in the state of California, you don't want anybody stabbing you in the brain. By the way, if you can possibly avoid brain surgery, do so. I know some horrendous stories. Well, I don't even want to tell you. The worst case was a woman who had terrible pains in her foot. And the crazy doctors got the idea, it's something wrong with her brain. We have to operate. Well, that's a great idea. So they sought a second opinion, who's a friend of mine who's a neuroscientist in San Diego. And he thought this was insane to operate on the woman's brain to cure the pain in her foot. And he told this woman, go to the local basketball team, I don't know who it is, probably the Lakers, and ask them who, they always have foot problems, who they send their guys to when they get a sore foot. But don't for heaven's sakes, go to a brain surgeon for your sore foot. Anyway, so be careful of brain surgeons. And you know, if you have to have somebody stab you in the brain, well, I guess you do. But avoid it if at all possible. Okay, so that takes care of agentive functions. Now, when I say that all functions are observer relative, that upsets a lot of people because they think, well, then biology wouldn't be a science because we can discover that the function of the heart is to pump blood, or the function of the vestibular ocular reflex is to stabilize the retinal image. And of course you can, but you know, the observer relativity and hence ontological subjectivity of the subject matter does not imply that you cannot have an epistemically objective science of the domain in question. So there's no so it doesn't follow that biology can't be a science, that biology is largely about ascertaining functions, what's the function of the liver, the function of the heart, and so on. I don't have the one you were looking for, but we got lots of other sheets if you'd like one of these. No, it's probably no use to you. Okay, all right, so that takes care of that. Any questions about that? Because now I want to go on to the next question, which we did not settle satisfactorily on Tuesday, and that is the great question of functional explanations in the social sciences and Hempel's discovery that they are scientifically dubious. Actually, I looked at that article again. It's a really good article, Hempel's The Logic of Functional Explanations. It makes the mistake he always makes about deductive nomological explanation. But, you know, you could write that for yourself. I mean, he said that over and over for like 50 years. He was a marvelous man, by the way. For reasons that have never been clear to me, nobody ever called him Carl Gustav. He was always known as Peter Hempel. And I never had the nerve to ask him, how come everybody calls you Peter and not Carl Gustav? Because in all the books he's Carl Gustav Hempel. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about. Any questions about agentive functions and status functions before we launch into that discussion? Okay, let's go through a whole series then of forms of explanation in the social sciences. Now, the tacit assumption behind most of the authors you have read is that the favorite type of explanation, the one that is an honest-to-John scientific explanation, is a deductive nomological explanation. It's the DN model of explanation. And as you know, on the deductive nomological model, you explain a phenomenon by subsuming it under a general law. So to take the tiresome example I always give you, if you want to know why, notice not just how or when or where, but why did this object fall the distance that it fell in the amount of time that it was falling, you can explain that by citing the law that determines the very values of the different parameters. The space or distance that it falls is equal to 1/2 of the gravitational constant times the square of the time that it falls. And the idea is that you have this as your general premise, then you give a description of the amount of time that it fell. You just give a statement of that, and it'll follow. You can deduce the value of S. It is a straightforward deductive process by which you derive the thing to be explained, the explanandum, as they say, from the explanation, the explanans. And that's everybody's favorite model of an explanation. So here's the picture they have. In honest-to-John sciences like physics, you use the DN model of explanation. It works beautifully. There's a little problem that comes up about statistical explanations, but Hempel has something to say about that. But now then the question is, well, what about the social sciences? Why don't they do it like that? Now, there are various ways of answering that question, but I want everybody to see this is the picture that people have. I'm going to challenge every damn step in this picture, but I want you to know what they are, because the guys who advance this are very smart guys, and who knows, maybe, I was going to say maybe they're right and I'm wrong, but that's insincere. I don't really think that. I don't think they got a hope, but I'm going to tell you what their view is. Anyway, before I tell you what I think is wrong with it, they think the DN model is dandy. It's what science ought to be like, and if the social sciences are ever going to be honest to John, then they got to do something like the DN model of explanation. One of the great virtues of the deductive nomological model of explanation is that it seems to give us a perfect symmetry between explanation and prediction. Because just as you can deduce what happened in the past and thus explain it, so you can deduce what's going to happen in the future and thus predict it. Prediction and explanation are absolutely symmetrical. The only difference is predictions about the future or unknown, and explanation is about the past or the known. Roughly speaking, explanations are a set of predictions about what has already happened. So you explain what already happened by showing that it had to happen because of the laws and the statement of the initial conditions. Okay, now there are a series of questions that come up for anybody who believes in the DN model. One is, what about the social sciences? We don't seem to get cases like S equals 1/2 GT squared. We don't get Newtonian mechanics for the social sciences. Now, Hempel was a man of great courage, and he said, well, you do. It's just not quite so rigorous as this. It's just messier because societies are more complicated. But he says, let's take an example. Why did the Dust Bowl farmers in Oklahoma migrate to California in the Dust Bowl era, in the period of the great droughts in Oklahoma? Why did they migrate to California? Well, he says there's a general rule. It's not 100%. It's not like S equals 1/2 GT squared, but it's a general rule, and he's courageous enough to state it. In general, when people find life unsatisfactory in a given location, and they know that there's a better life available at an alternative location which is accessible to them, they will tend to go from the place where life is lousy to the place where life is desirable. They will tend to go to the promised land, and you didn't know it, but that's where you live, in the promised land, otherwise known as California, and they all wanted to get here, according to his theory. So, on the account that he gave us of the DN model, it does work for the social sciences. It's just, and so that's why the social sciences are honest to John sciences, because the DN model works for them. It just works in a rough and ready fashion. You don't get precise laws. The laws aren't exceptionalist. You have to cite all sorts of countervailing factors that can come in. And the sheer complexity of the phenomena makes it more complicated. Furthermore, even in physics, there are statistical laws. And how do you explain things on the DN model according to the statistical laws? Well, if you have a statistical probability of something occurring of, say, 80%, and you want to know why such and such occurred, you can say, well, the probability of its occurring was 80%. The problem with that is it's got a problem about the other 20%, because when one of the other things happens, You have to say, why did it happen? Well, it's part of the other 20%. But now you begin to get worried about that. That ought to make us nervous about the DN model, because no matter what the hell happens, it looks like we've got an explanation. If it happened the way 80% happens, well, then that's because it's part of the 80%. If it didn't happen, but it was it was part of the 20%, well, the reason it happened was because it was part of the other 20%. That ought to make us nervous. Okay, I'll come back to that. Now we're still struggling. We're going to go on to functional explanations in the social sciences. Now, there was a period in the social sciences when functional explanations were extremely popular. And I think, now there are people here who actually know about this stuff who can correct me, but I think the guy who was more than anybody else responsible for that was Robert Merton. And he was a guy I knew. I knew him, but not really terribly well. He sent me a copy of his book, which, alas, I never read. But anyhow, I had the idea that what we're looking for in sociology is to find explanations of phenomena which would explain them by showing the functions that they performed, even in cases where the functions were not really intended. It might turn out that there were social institutions that functioned and consequently had an explanation in terms of the function, where the explanation cited a latent function and not a manifest function. So the manifest function is the official function. The latent function is the unofficial function, but actually explains the phenomenon. So if you look at university commencement addresses and brochures, the manifest function of intercollegiate athletics is it builds character and develops strong and healthy bodies. If you actually look at the income records of, say, the University of Southern California, it turns out that the football team has functions that go beyond building character. It brings in a lot of money, especially from the alumni. So in addition to the manifest function of making for strong bodies and great moral character, it also has a latent function of bringing in a lot of cash. Now, the favorite examples of manifest and latent function are the kind of things where they weren't likely to get an argument from the people involved, and these were cases where they went to native societies, and Malinowski is Hempel's favorite example here. So here's a case of manifest and latent function. Rain dances, witchcraft, and magic in general are not very productive if you think of them just as attempts to influence the course of events. I don't know that anybody's done a study, but one doesn't have to guess too far to see what the results would be. If we hired two tribes, one of them did a rain dance regularly to bring rain, and the other one abstained from rain dances. Then we might discover, I would hazard the prediction, that the rain dance makes no damn difference whatever to the weather. On the contrary, if it did make a difference, it would be a miracle, and we'd have to revise a whole lot of other opinions that we hold. Okay, now, says Malinowski, all the same, we can explain the survival of the rain dance and magic in general because it leads to social stability. It produces social stability, and that explains its survival. Now, Hempel is extremely suspicious of that, and he gives a criticism of it. He says that you can't use the model of explanation that they're using because it commits a fallacy. You can't say if rain dance, then stability, and argue, well, the explanation of the rain dance is we've got stability. The question is, why is there a rain dance given that it doesn't bring rain? And the answer is because it brings stability. That is a fallacy. It's a fallacy of affirming the consequent. If P then Q, and Q, therefore P, is a fallacy. The standard modus ponens argument, which is not a fallacy, is if P, then Q, and P, therefore Q. But this would be a fallacious inference to the stabilizing factor, namely the rain dance. And from the fact that you have stability and the rain dance leads to stability, that does not explain the rain dance. It is a straightforward fallacy. Furthermore, says Hempel, it's very hard to see how these explanations are actually testable. And he has a wonderful quotation from Malinowski, which I'll read to you. It's in the reader that you have. See if I can find it. Where Malinowski is talking about how, in general, this is on page 365 of the Logic of Functional Analysis, and I don't know what page it is, in page 79 of the, I have an earlier edition of your reader.
105.
Is it 105? Okay. Anyway, he says a similar content is applicable to the following pronouncement by Malinowski, and then I'll read you the passage. When we consider any culture which is not on the point of breaking down or completely disrupted, but which is a normal going concern, we find that need and response are directly related and tuned up to each other. In other words, if the culture is healthy, then its needs and responses fit each other nicely. Now, Hempel says it's hard to see how you would test that, but because what would count as a healthy society in which need and response are not tuned up to each other. That is, it looks like he's saying a tautology, if it's healthy, or if you got need and response tuned up to each other, then need and response are tuned up to each other. In other words, the criterion for the tune-up and the criteria for health look like they're too close together to be what would seem to Hempel to be a legitimate scientific explanation. Okay, now what's going on here? Well, now this is not what Hempel says, but I'm going to add a few comments. There's a long discussion about these issues that goes back to Aristotle. Famously, Aristotle said there are four kinds of causes. There are material causes, and the favorite textbook example is the statue. If it's made of bronze, then the material cause is the bronze. There's the formal cause, and that is the shape of the statue. And then there's the efficient cause, what actually brought it about, and that's the sculptor who made the casting where the bronze was poured in, the efficient cause. And then there's the final cause, and that's the purpose for which the statue was made. Now, another name for the final cause is teleology. And for a long time, teleological explanations, where you identify the cause of the explanation of something in terms of the purpose that it serves, were regarded as an appropriate model of explanation. Indeed, according to standard histories, in the Middle Ages, prior to the 17th century, people thought to explain the trajectory of a body passing through the air, you have to explain the purpose that it's trying to attain. That you have to specify the purpose. It's trying to attain a certain goal, and in general, that's what physical explanation looks like. It is in terms of teleology or goal. The teleology is the purpose or the goal which something serves. Now, of those four causes, formal cause, material cause, efficient cause, and final cause, I don't know Greek, but that must be a mistranslation, because the bronze isn't the cause of the statue, and the shape isn't the cause of the statue. Those aren't even candidates for cause. So I'm just assuming either Aristotle was dumber than we thought, and I don't really believe that, he was very smart, or they're mistranslating. By the way, this is very common. A standard line in moral philosophy and my philosophy was, well, Aristotle just didn't have any decent sense of moral obligation. It never occurred to them, maybe the Greeks had a different conception of what we call moral obligation, as if Aristotle was trying to be an Oxford don or an English schoolmaster, but somehow failed to make the grade. So I think that's probably just a mistranslation. But the two candidates are efficient cause and final cause, and final causes have become illegitimate, and I think for good reason. You can't cite the goal that is attained by a phenomenon as the explanation of the phenomenon, because then the explanation would come after the thing that it's supposed to explain. What you can cite is the desire to achieve the goal. In other words, if I work on Wall Street to make a lot of money, then the cause or the explanation of my working on Wall Street is not that I make a lot of money, but rather that I desire to make a lot of money. I want to make a lot of money. So that a version of the teleology will survive in the form of intentional causation, but that is a subclass, as we know, of efficient causation. Okay, so the actual cause of the phenomenon in the case of teleological causation is not the final stage, but rather the desire or the aim or the intentionality that leads to the final stage, and that's a subclass of efficient causation. So what I'm arguing here is, in fact, there aren't four kinds of causes. There's only one, and that's efficient causation, where you want to know, when you want to know the cause, you want to know what made it happen. And there's a subclass of efficient causation where you cite the intentional state that brings something about, and that is a case, as you know by now, of intentional causation, and it functions crucially in the social sciences. Okay, but now we're still stuck with deductive nomological explanation and functional explanation. And are either of those any good? What's to be said for either of them? I'm going to go on to that now, but I want to make sure everybody's up with us, so let's take questions. Arden had a question.
I have a question on functional explanation. I'm not defending functional explanation, but it seems like you could have the same explanation without appealing to teleology if instead of saying that it was social cohesion that caused the rain dance, there were some, sort of in the natural selection style
Yes, right.
where they incidentally had, the rain dance incidentally caused social cohesion, and those that had the rain
Social cohesion survived.
And that would remove the teleology.
Right. No, that's very good. And if I had made notes for this lecture, you would be reading my next note, because that's the thing I'm going to say next. And that is the idea, the way to rescue functional explanation is to appeal to the analogy with Darwinian explanation in biology. And then the question we're going to face is, does that work? Is the functional explanation in sociology like the functional explanation in Darwinian biology? And I'm going to argue there's a crucial hole in the functional explanation which you don't get in biology. Okay, other questions at this point? And actually I've covered an awful lot of ground, but some of this we've already, basically the basic ideas you should be familiar with. This is a review session, and I shouldn't say anything that's new and exciting. So if you fall asleep, my feelings won't be hurt. Okay, so now let's consider the next step of the argument. The next step of the argument goes, but look, there are areas in which functional explanation plainly works. And it plainly works not as a form of teleology, but rather as a replacement for teleology. So if you look at pre-Darwinian biology and you ask, what's the explanation of the plants turning their leaves toward the sun, the answer is it serves a certain purpose. It serves the purpose of the plant to augment the amount of sunlight, to increase the rate of photosynthesis, and thus increase the plant's chance of survival. So turning the leaves toward the sun is explained by the purpose of the plant in attaining survival. Now, the Darwinian model of explanation replaces that with two levels, a functional explanation and a causal, and this is what they say in the textbooks, functional explanation and a causal explanation. Actually, they're both causal, so it's misleading, but I'm going to tell you what they are. First, you give a causal explanation. You see, the original explanation had one level. The plant turns its leaves toward the sun for a purpose in order to survive. That's illegitimate because the plants don't have purposes. They got no intentionality. Okay, we're going to substitute two levels of explanation for that, and here are the two levels. There is a purely mechanical explanation of why plants turn their leaves toward the sun, and that is they secrete a growth hormone, and there are variable secretions of the growth hormone. It's called auxin. There are variable secretions of the growth hormone in response to degrees of sunlight. And the effect of that is almost magical, because you see the plant, I mean, in slow motion pictures, you see the plant gradually turning to follow the sun as the variable secretions of auxin turn it. Now, there's notice no purpose there. It's just a piece of machinery. The auxin just functions as a machinery turning the leaves toward the sun. But now comes the functional explanation. Plants that do that are more likely to survive than plants that don't. Now, notice we got two levels of explanation. The original level was teleological. Plants turn their leaves in order to survive. And now we've got two levels. Plants turn their leaves because there's a growth hormone that causes them to turn their leaves. Straightforward causal explanation. But now notice there's still survival still functions in the explanation, but it's no longer specified as a goal or a cause, but rather it's just something that happens. That is, plants that turn their leaves in that way are more likely to survive than those that don't, and those that survive will reproduce, and thus the species will continue. I'll take questions in a second. I want you to see another feature of the Darwinian model of explanation, and that is it brings in time. As they love to say in the textbooks, it's diachronic. And I don't know what the hell that means, but it's supposed to be opposed to synchronic. And I always forget which is which, so put question mark if you're taking notes. Diachronic, anyway, I know about time, and it extends over time, and we've got an explanation that stretches across time. So once you bring in time, then you have really quite a beautiful explanation. You want to know why plants turn their leaves toward the sun? There's the synchronic or immediate explanation. This juice is being squirted out, and it mechanically turns the leaf toward the sun. But there's also a long-term diachronic explanation in terms of the survival of the plant, and plants that do that are more likely to survive than plants that don't. So survival still functions, but it's no, in the explanation, but it's no longer a goal, it's just something that happens. Now here's the idea. Let's do that with sociology. So the rain dance and the rain dance will be like turning the leaf toward the sun. The rain dance will lead to social stability, and that's why it survives. But now, if you're going to do that, you've got to cite something analogous to the level of auxin. You have to, if this explanation is going to work as a scientific explanation, there has to be some level of explanation in addition to the functional level that shows how the causal mechanism operates, and that has not so far been given to us. So it seems to me we don't really yet have an analogy with the Darwinian. See, the picture that I think a lot of these guys had is, look, sociology is going to be more like biology than like physics. And in evolutionary biology, we do have functional explanations. There isn't any question about that. So why can't we have functional explanations in sociology and anthropology? And the idea was that they'll be just like functional explanations in evolutionary biology. But the analogy breaks down if you can't specify the causal mechanism. Okay, so now we're getting to the point where we can actually make some criticism, but I want to take question. First you, and then you. Yes. You.
Why can't the belief in a certain type of magic be to auxin?
Yes. The question, right. The question, though, is why does the institution survive if it doesn't work? If there is no continuing. If there is no increase in the probability of rain as a result of the rain dance.
Right, but the belief,
yeah.
those who possess the belief are more likely to...
Okay, no, I like that. But if we say, Well, the real explanation, and I think this is probably, actually is the explanation, is not that it leads to social stability, but that people continue to believe in it irrationally. And if that's the case, then where's the functional explanation? See, what you've got is an actual causal mechanism that produces the phenomenon. But now, what's the role of the functional explanation in your explanation? So, if you ask me commonsensically, why does the rain dance survive when it doesn't bring rain? And the answer is because people don't reflect on the actual probability that it's going to rain. They have faith. And they have faith that the rain dance will bring about rain. And when it doesn't, well, try again. And there are lots of studies that show that precisely this sort of irrationality exists in very emotional religious groups. So, for example, no one has done this study, but I venture to say if you did a study of the efficacy of prayer, let's say, you get a section of the population that prays and a section of the population that doesn't pray, and let's suppose that it turns out that the prayer doesn't make a damn bit of difference, as I think is probably quite likely. I don't want to step on anybody's religious toenails here, but assume, give me for the sake of argument, that the prayer doesn't make a difference. Why do people keep praying? The answer is not because they have more social stability. The answer is because they haven't lost their faith. And I think that's the answer in this case. They haven't lost their faith in the rain dance. So I like your answer. I think that's probably the correct answer, but it doesn't meet the constraint that it's got to give a mechanism that produces social stability, which will provide the cause for the survival of the phenomenon in question. Okay, you're next, and then there are a whole lot of other hands up. Yes, Art.
All right. So could a mechanistic or the causal component in sociological functional explanation, in the rain dance example, is something like, okay, so you have a functional component that rain dance leads to social cohesion, which leads to survival, and then you have the causal component where you actually specify things like, well, in the rain dance, people actually come together at a specific time of the day.
Yeah.
They meet people, they talk to each other,
Yeah.
social cohesion causally, which then social cohesion decreases the chances of civil war, say, which
Yeah.
leads causally to increased.
Yeah. So it would be just like the survival of the plant. Then, if they didn't have the rain dance, they wouldn't survive, or at least their survival chances would be severely diminished. So there would be, yeah. So the analogy to oxen here, the analogy to oxen would be, following your idea, the analogy to oxen would be the belief in the efficacy of the rain dance leads to social stability, and the social stability is the analogy to the survival of the plant species. Okay, I'm going to come back to this in a minute when we talk about intentional causation, because I think the actual mechanism that's working here is intentional causation and not a functional explanation. Yes, say some more though.
Combining intentional causation and functional analysis, don't you get the two components that are at work in Darwinian theory?
Well, the idea of Darwinian theory is there is no intentionality. In the case of the oxen, there is no intentionality whatever. Darwin's great revolution was to remove intentionality from the explanation of the origin of species and replace it with purely mechanical processes. The underlying causal mechanisms, and then the natural selection. This is why I call it natural selection, because there's no actual intentionality going on, no selection. Yeah.
But in a human case,
Yeah.
the mechanistic one would be replaced by
An intentional phenomenon. Yeah.
But you could keep the functional, the other component, the one
Yeah.
that says it leads to.
Okay, now I guess Hempel's answer would be, okay, if you spell it out in that way, how do you test it? Yeah. Oh, that's another question. All right, now there's some other hands up at the very back.
Well, I was going to say something similar, and I guess I'm thinking about if the planet, the oxen is making it turn,
Yeah.
it doesn't have this teleological survival. It's still going to turn because it has to.
Yeah.
Because of its chemical thing, it's just maybe going to die faster. So I don't know if maybe the rain dance is like that basic, is they do it because they have to. I feel like the survival is a result, not a cause.
Yeah.
They could say oxen causes turning, which results in more sunlight.
Yeah.
More sunlight results in
Yeah.
Similar to what she's saying, the rain dance, causes cohesion. The cohesion causes survival, but
Yeah.
separating it, you can't go from being seen.
Well, this was Arden's proposal then, that we treat the belief as analogous to the oxen. And your answer to that is yes, but there is no intentionality at all in the case of the oxen, whereas here the belief is an essential part of the mechanism. But I think her answer to that would be, okay, so what? So you got belief functioning as part of the mechanism. There were some other hands up. Yes?
Yeah, but still, are we struggling with affirming the consequent here if we do go down this route of biological
Yeah.
explanation?
Yeah.
Because there's any number of things that could cause social cohesion besides the rain dance.
Yeah.
So Temple's issue here is that it's not tested, isn't it?
Well, okay, but are we really being fair to this mode of explanation if we say that? Because if we say that in the case of the, I suppose we say that if a turning of oxen then survival, if turning of leaves then survival is a fallacy of affirming the consequent as well. I think these guys would have an answer to that, because the argument is not they survive, therefore that explains why they turn oxen, but rather over a long period of time, plants that turn the oxen that way are going to survive, that turn the leaves that way are going to survive, and plants that don't won't, and that's the conditional, not this other one, not the one that leads to the fallacy of affirming the consequent.
Right, but I'm talking about the rain dance case where
Yeah.
you have this rain dance.
Yeah.
Seems to imply social stability.
Yeah.
But I think, if I understand Apple's article correctly, he's saying that there are any number of things that could cause social cohesion.
Yeah.
It's much harder to test and see
Yeah.
whether or not the rain dance is actually causing that social cohesion
Right.
as opposed to testing whether or not oxen causes the plant to turn.
Okay, but now that is a different argument. And that's an argument that says you have multiple forms in which the causes of social stability can take place, and you don't have a test that will isolate whether or not it's this form or another form.
Right.
And that, I think that's probably right, but I don't see that. Why should that worry Merton? Why should that worry the guy who says, well, okay, there are different causes of social stability, but one is the latent function of the rain dance and forms of magic generally. Yes?
The reason why it's worrying them is because the premises don't necessitate the conclusions in the
Yeah.
way that the end, the premises necessitate
Yeah.
the conclusions.
Well, here's the problem. If you say, look, in our society, prayer may not increase the probability that what you pray for is going to happen, but it does increase social stability because people go to church and they form groups and they have all sorts of religious organizations and so on, and that leads to social stability. But the difficulty is you have to ask, what is the question you're trying to answer? And if the question you're trying to answer is, why do people pray and why do people perform the rain dance, I think his answer is right. It's not for social stability. They pray because they have faith, because they believe in it. And the fact that the prayer doesn't always work or it doesn't work any more than random behavior, that's beside the point. What we're talking about is the form of their intentionality. Yes, Arden. By the way, this looks to me like a good exam question because the discussion is very good. A lot of good ideas are coming out here. Yeah.
I guess the whole idea of what's the question, it seems like functional explanation could maybe, I mean, I don't really know, but could maybe be a good form of explanation for questions like, why did the rain dance survive? Not
Yeah.
why did people do the rain dance? Just like we say that a Darwinian explanation is something like, why do plants turn their
Leaves toward the sun, yeah.
Why does this plant's leaf turn toward the sun? Because then you just have to cite
Yeah, then you cite oxen. You have to have a general question. Why do plants turn their leaves toward the sun? And now we're asking the general question, why do primitive society, I don't know if anthropologists are allowed to say primitive anymore because, it's racist and imperialist and all sorts of other things. But let's be politically incorrect. Why do primitive societies believe in magic? And why do they still have rain dances? And the answer is it leads to social stability. And the objection we're making to that is that so far we haven't got an answer to the oxen. We don't have something that fills in the value of the oxen. And if you say, yes, the belief fills in the value of the oxen, the problem with that is that just explains why they do what they do and does not explain the persistence in the face of recalcitrant evidence. Okay, there were other questions. I saw some other hands up. All right, I want to attack the whole approach that we've been adopting here. I want to say the whole discussion is based on a certain false assumptions. And I want to say something that's heretical, and that is that the actual explanation of the DN model of explanation is not the syntactical structure of the derivation, that you have a general law and a description of specific cases and then a derivation of the thing that you're trying to explain, but rather that the general law is a causal law, and it cites causes that apply in every case. What explains this object falling is the force of gravity, and what explains its falling, the specific amount that it did, is the specific amount of force exerted by the force of gravity. What the law does is give a summary, in this case an infinite summary, of a set of causes that are universally applicable. But we have mistaken the logical form of the derivation. You can state a general law and description of initial conditions and then derive what's going to happen. We've assumed that that is what is explanatory. What's explanatory is not that, it's the cause. There actually has to be a cause operating, and that's what explains it. Now, when we have these statistical cases, the reason that they're embarrassing to us is it looks vacuous to say, well, if it happens, that shows that it's one of the 80% of the time, and if it didn't happen, that shows it's one of the 20% of the time where it doesn't happen. That explains nothing. That's vacuous. What we really want to know is what were the causes in any particular case. And in this case, we assume Newton's law is universal. We assume the law of gravity is universal, and that's why we can get this general law. So I want to say, far from it being the case that the DN model of explanation is the paradigm of explanation, I want to say as a model, it never works. What works is that typically the nomological feature cites a cause. It cites a universal cause. But what has happened, and this is characteristic of intellectual life in the 20th century, and it extends into the 21st, we have mistaken the formal structure of the model for the explanatory power. The formal structure is you have a universal statement of a law, a description of an initial condition, and then a derivation of what's going to happen. But that formal structure isn't what explains. What explains is that the universal statement of the law cites a cause, and it's the cause that does the explaining. Now, why would anybody make this mistake? Why would they think that the explanatory feature is the syntax, that there's a universal statement from which you can derive a specific a prediction of a specific instance? And the answer is Hume. Hume taught us the wrong lesson. Hume taught us there are no such things as causes in nature. There are only universal regularities. And the answer to that is there are such things as causes in nature. You want to see one? I will cause this thing to go up by lifting it, and I experience myself causing it to go up. Hume's great message was there are no causal connections in nature. There are just universal regularities. And as philosophers, you're all brought up to believe that. That is all. It's part of the standard lore that undergraduates and graduates get. So then the question is, well, in any causal statement, what fact makes it true? And the fact that makes it true is not that there's an actual force between the cause and the effect, but the fact that they instantiate, they exemplify an absolutely universal generalization. Now, I think that is false. There actually are causes in nature. In nature, some things make other things happen. The Oakland freeway collapsed because it got a bad shaking up due to the Loma Prieta earthquake. That's a straightforward transmission of causal forces from Loma Prieta right to Oakland. And that's the causes of its collapsing. Now, in general, you can find a universal statement corresponding to causal statements, but not always. If you want to know the causes of the First World War, there won't be any general laws because the size of events picked out by laws are not the size of events picked out by expressions like the First World War or the failure of international negotiations at the time of the Algeciras crisis or other causes that people would cite inciting the cause of the First World War. So I'm making a heretical claim, two claims. One, the DN model doesn't even work for physics. What works is causation. And the DN model gives the illusion that it works because we tacitly assume that the nomological part, the end part of the DN model, cites an actual causal law. But just the correlation between A and B. Why is the sun shining in Berkeley? Well, there's a universal correlation. First you get sunshine, and then you get dark, and then you get sunshine, and then you get dark, and that's why the sun is shining in Berkeley. That doesn't explain it at all. What's explained? Well, I won't give you the explanation. You all know it. But just the sheer fact of the correlation, the fact of a universal correlation is not explanatory. It's only explanatory if it's causal. Furthermore, it's just wrong to say that deduction, that explanation and prediction are perfectly symmetrical, because explanation is supposed to tell you the causes of something happened, why something happened, and the prediction is just supposed to enable you to get an accurate projection of what's going to happen in the future. I get a sort of prediction from my barometer, but it isn't that the barometer reading causes it to rain. There is, suppose there's a universal correlation. That doesn't explain anything, it just enables me to predict. So, to summarize this, the deductive nomological model doesn't even work for physics. What works is causation, and the causation is implicit in the DN model because the nomological element, the law-like element, typically cites a cause. Why would anybody have made this mistake? I think it's an obvious mistake, and the answer is because Hume taught us that there are no causes in nature. There are only regularities. So Hume says you can't find a necessary connection. What then makes a causal statement true? What makes it true is it instantiates an absolutely universal exceptionless regularity. And this is why there is no real problem about the statistical cases. If you say, well, statistically, you've got an 80% chance of getting cancer if you're a regular smoker. So if you get cancer, what actually caused you to get cancer in that case was the action of the nicotine on your cells that produced a cancerous multiplication. The generalization isn't what explains. What explains is the actual causal mechanism, and that causal mechanism is not 100%. You can't get a 100% law correlating smoking and cancer. So the question, well, how can it explain anything if it's not 100%, is it doesn't explain anything when it is 100%. What actually explains is the citing of the causal mechanism. And now then, when we go back to functional explanations, if you can cite a causal mechanism, then it seems to me, and this is what various people were saying, you have got an explanation, but you must be careful to specify what it is exactly that you're trying to explain. If you want to explain the survival of the rain dance in the face of continued bad weather, I think it's faith. People have belief in the rain dance. Now let's go back to Hempel's favorite example, the movement of the Okies to California at the time of the great drought, of the Dust Bowl, as it was called in Texas and Oklahoma. What explains is not the generalization. People are more likely to move from one place to another if they're dissatisfied with where they live, but rather individual intentionality. In all of these cases, ask what it would be like for me. Here I am in the grapes of wrath. I am Ma Jode assembling my brood together and putting them in the Model T Ford. Now what, I don't think, gosh, here I am statistically part of a population that is deprived. No, I think, let's go to California. They have a better life there. Intentional causation is what actually drives human behavior in these cases as in other cases. So the illusion that Hempel has got a deductive nomological model working in sociology when he explains the movement of the Oklahoma farmers by citing a generalization, I think that's an illusion. The actual causes is always individual. Now there will be, if there's general dissatisfaction, there'll be a lot more of those. But the actual causal mechanism is in specific individuals moving for specific reasons. Okay, now I saw a whole lot of hands up. I don't know who was first, but you seem to be ready to talk. Yes?
You said that lies will cite a causal mechanism.
Yes. If you want to know what makes this damn thing fall, it's gravity.
That was actually my question.
Yeah.
Is it a causal mechanism?
Yeah, there is a force. I mean, it's literally a force. There is a force that now it's a total mystery. Nobody knows why there's gravity. I mean, see, these guys tell us a pack of lies. They tell us physics explains all this stuff. Oh yeah, ask the physicist, why does gravity exist? Nobody knows. At least last time I nacked my physicist friends about this. But it is a force. There really is a force. The damn thing really is attracted to the center of the Earth. Why? Because it's a hell of a big mass, and it's the mass of the center of the Earth, and this is a little bitty mass, and it's attracted to the center of the Earth. And that cites an actual force. See, the beauty of physics, I mean, the kind of physics I was brought up on, is it's about real causes. I actually think if we really understood F equals ma, we'd know a hell of a lot about how the universe works. Force equals mass times acceleration. All you got to do is watch a football game or try to get your car started, and you will see F equals ma in action. So those are cite actual forces, and gravity is an actual force. Okay, other questions? Yes, somebody else? Yes. Yes. Yeah.
You can say if you smoke every day, this movie can cause you 80%.
Yeah, you will increase the probability that you're going to die spectacularly. I mean, it is a stunning fact that people continue to smoke. And I don't want to become a social bore, but I'm often urged to go up to young people on the street who are busy puffing away and say, for God's sake, stop smoking. Haven't you read the statistics? And in Europe, it's much worse than here. I mean, California is pretty much smoke-free. But I've just come back from Madrid, and my God, well, I don't even want to think about it because they're all busy committing suicide. Yes, but it's a causal mechanism, and we have got certain generalizations about the causal mechanism. But the human body is complicated. There are all sorts of causes operating, and there's always I love the anecdotal arguments. People always tell you, well, my uncle lived to be 97 years old and smoked 5 packs a day to the day he died. Well, okay, sure. Anecdotal mechanism, hardly anything is proven by that. Okay, other questions here? Because now there's another topic I want to take up. Yeah, Arden, you want to come in on this?
I was just wondering if you could, to help us all understand,
Yeah.
give us a sort of summary of your positive.
Yeah, my positive view can be summarized very swiftly, and that is explanations typically cite causes. What made it happen? Where social explanation is concerned, the causes are typically in the form of intentional causation. Why did the Democrats do so badly in the November elections? And the form is intentional causation. That's the simple version of Searle's view. Now, it gets messier and less intellectually satisfying when we get to the background and the network, when we get to forms of intentional causation which are not really intentionality, where there are dispositions to behavior you have that are pre-intentional. You just have a set of background dispositions, expectations, stances, ways of behaving that are not straightforward intentional causation, but nonetheless are psychologically real. You have a set of expectations. There are various things I could do now. I won't imitate them, but suppose I could throw up at will, let's say. Well, that's a terrible example. But there are various things I could do that would produce... I've often thought that would be useful in car accidents. If you could just go between the cars and throw up, you would rhetorically have the advantage in the discussion. But in any case, there are various forms of bizarre behavior that you don't expect and you don't have beliefs about, but which run against the background. So intentional causation is complicated by the fact that all intentionality comes in holistic networks. See, I'm always struck by the fact that the Germans and the Japanese misunderstood the Americans so badly. Hitler was always amazed that Roosevelt didn't have Anschluss with Canada. You know, in 1936, we had more troops than the Canadians. Why didn't we annex Canada? If you had told anybody that then or now, they would have burst out laughing. One of the marks of the background is it's what makes people laugh when it's violated. The Marx Brothers made their career on background violating jokes. And again, the Japanese totally misunderstood the Americans because they thought we were all rational actors. We would calculate our rational advantage after our Pacific fleet was sunk and figure out we're better off making a deal with the Japanese. Well, that's not how it works, not how it worked with the Americans and not how it worked with any other great power. So you have intentional causation functioning against a background set of dispositions and capacities that are typically not in the form of explicit beliefs. Yes?
So when you're saying that we need to account for intentional causation when we explain human behavior,
Yeah.
is that also, we need to account for the reason that was made effective? Is that also?
Yes, you need to account for, well, okay, rational explanations typically presuppose free will. And that is that the reason becomes effective because you act on it. You decide that you're going to act on that reason. There are various possibilities open, and then you have to decide which reason you're going to act on. Now, it gets complicated for various other reasons. In the social sciences, you can find law-like systematic fallouts of intentional causation. So this is how economists make their living. You assume that entrepreneurs are trying to make money, and you assume that consumers are trying to be better off rather than worse off, and that given those assumptions, and those are written out as a set of axioms, you can have a deductive model. And the word model here is right for economics. You can have a model of the behavior of the firm, and that's what microeconomics is about. You make a set of assumptions, and then that will predict that the entrepreneur will sell where these two lines intersect, where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Now, that is not explicitly intentional causation, because the entrepreneur isn't thinking, I got to sell where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. What he's doing is, we got to make money. How can we hold down costs? How can we get a better product? How can we compete with other products? And then this you can predict on this because it's a systematic fallout or consequence of intentional causation, even though it's not explicitly intentional causation. So the point I'm making is that the driving force in the social sciences is intentional causation, given the network and the background. And those are non-trivial constraints, because the background figures crucially in the differences between one society and another. However, this doesn't mean that you cannot have law-like forms in the social sciences. You can, because often you can get laws, laws in quotes here, which do not cite intentional causation, but cite systematic consequences of intentional causation. So you can have laws that say that if a country increases its interest rates, the value of its currency will go up. And that's not because anybody is thinking in those terms, but rather the increase in interest rates makes it more desirable to buy that currency to invest in that country, and so on. So that again is a systematic fallout. So you can have explanatory laws that don't mention intentionality, but give a summary of systematic consequences of intentionality. Now I wanted to save enough time. How much time do I have? Oh my gosh. Oh well. I wanted to answer Colin McGinn on, because that would be an exam question too. Remember, I gave you Colin's review in the New York Review of Books. And I think I'll put my reply on the website. I sent him a reply, and they said it's too long. Would you please shorten it to 750 words? Well, Colin, I can't even clear my throat in 700, but I did, sort of, 850. Why be pedantic? But I'm going to have two replies, one that I want him to publish, and then one I'll put on the website, and I'll send you the one for publication. But basically, his main objection to me is he says, I assume you need language for social institutions. And he says, he doesn't see why you need language. Why can't we all just think? And we don't even need words to think. We'll just think in concepts. So you can have money, property, government, marriage, and all the rest of it without any words at all, according to Colin, provided you just think in the concepts, and thinking is enough. Now, I'm going to say two things to that. One is thinking is not enough. You've got to communicate your thoughts. You have to tell people, this is money, this person is my spouse, I'm a citizen of the United States. There has to be communication. But more importantly, the concepts in question require some vehicle. They require some means in which the the concept is realized in your thought processes. And you can see this with any complicated thought. Here's a thought I had at breakfast today. All his hassles about the deficit confuse the deficit and the national debt. The deficit's only a problem if the national debt is out of hand or getting out of hand. But short-term deficits by themselves are not a major social problem. Okay, a simple thought, one you all had as freshmen. I now think that very thought without any words. Okay, I can't do it. You know, what do? I could abbreviate it, call it thought number 17. Okay, then I think 17, you know, like the joke club, where they all know the joke, so they just give the number, and then everybody laughs. Except one guy laughed very hard at number 79, because that's because he'd never heard that one before. But in any case, you can't have complex thoughts without words. And Collins says, yeah, but who says it's logically impossible? Well, I don't know. Maybe angels or gods can have complex thought without words. But for us, you've got to. The basic point I'm going to make here is that concepts, the word concept is a very suspicious word anywhere. It's like meaning, and the temptation is the thing. So there's the word and the concept, or the word and the meanings. If you've got two separate entities, and there's no reason why you couldn't just have the meanings or the concepts without any words. That's not how it works for human beings. For human beings, you cannot have concepts pure. In your conscious thought processes, there has to be some medium in which the concept or the meaning is presented to your consciousness. It can be an image. Typically, for us, it's words, marks, or symbols of other kinds. Anyway, that's one argument that I'm going to give against. Yeah, my gosh. Okay. We're almost out of time. The last question gets to be Vanessa.
So the further point, though, is not, because somebody might say, oh, well, then just turn your word into something else, an image or something. But the point is that the word is a placeholder for a complex set of related...
Okay, that's the other point. And that is, you never have meanings in isolation. You see, in order to have my account of social reality, you got to have the notion of an obligation. But you can't have obligation without requirements, duties, actions, fulfillments, and you take money. You can't have the concept of money without the concept of exchange, value, buying, selling, paying, debts, and all the rest of it. That is to say, any of these notions only functions as part of a complex network of notions, and this, as you know, is holism. That is, I'm rejecting atomism about concepts in particular or intentionality in general. Okay, well, I will think of you while I'm stranded at Heathrow Airport. It's a terrible time of year to go to Europe. But anyway, I hope you enjoy the exam, and I have a good Christmas, have a good winter vacation.